unlike in a game, the real world doesn't have victory conditions. So when we try to say whether uh, a country or group or some such has won or lost a particular contest in, I think here I'll mostly be talking about warfare, but you could easily extend this to other things. The criteria by which we determine who has won is ultimately arbitrary. It depends on what the person doing the analyzing sees as valuable. I think the closest you could get to an objective measure would be what were the goals, what could we determine to be the goals of the given sides at that particular time, and did they accomplish them? We may have different opinions about their objectives and actions now, but we should evaluate their goals and whether they met them on their own terms, right? So people who say, oh, the US didn't really lose in Vietnam, for instance, those people are using a different standard for victory. They're using, if basically what they see as most important is not whether the US won politically. It didn't matter to them whether South Vietnam still existed after the Vietnam War. What was important, or I should say what is important, since this is more of a modern thing, what is important for them is, did the US demonstrate its martial prowess? Did they demonstrate effectiveness on the battlefield? Did they win the battles? Did they kill the enemy? Right? They weren't forced out of Vietnam. They left of their own accord. And that's political, and I don't care about that. However, it would be unfair to say that then the US didn't actually lose Vietnam, or that it's subjective. I mean, it is to some extent, but the goal at the time, even after the US left, was to keep southern Vietnam non-communist. They simply switched strategies. Initially, they tried backing the French somewhat tepidly. That didn't work out. Then they tried backing the Republic of Vietnam, Diem's regime. That also didn't work out very well. So, then they took over responsibility for it themselves. And that worked, but the limitations placed on their military action, both by themselves and by the inevitable consequences of not following them, i.e., Chinese and quite possibly Soviet intervention, meant that this strategy could not work. It would never end the war. It could simply create a perpetual stalemate, which would keep Vietnam non-communist, but it would require a perpetual, potentially never-ending commitment of American military forces. And that was not deemed a good idea, or a good use of people's lives. I agree with that, by the way. So they did what was called Vietnamization, where they tried to beef up the South Vietnamese military, so that they could defend themselves and the Americans could go home. So they thought they did that. They went home. And then the communists just crushed them anyway. So, by the standards of the people who started and fought the Vietnam War, the US lost. Of the three strategies they tried, or I guess if you count backing the French, sort of four, three of them were failures, and one of them could only win, quote unquote, with a perpetual application of military force, not dissimilar to what we now see in Afghanistan, which they weren't willing to continue with because, frankly, no one cared enough to keep getting people killed for such a ultimately pointless cause. Now, I flubbed there and mentioned South Korea, but the Korean War is also an interesting one, not the least because the Chinese insist to this day that they won, and determining whether they did win is an interesting question. Certainly, it is no secret that they became directly involved in Korea because they wanted to save Kim Il-sung's regime from being destroyed. And they certainly succeeded at that. They did. But, firstly, the North Koreans started it. And they only started it because Kim Il-sung was given basically a security guarantee by Mao, right? There was sort of this twice removed security guarantee on this whole thing. The North Koreans had an understanding with the Chinese that if this went wrong, China would bail them out. And if they didn't have to get involved. And the Chinese had signed a defense pact with the USSR. So if this went really wrong, the Soviets could bail the Chinese out. And these were designed to basically try to allow the communists to win without the Soviets having to do it themselves, which would obviously lead to World War III. So, well, you might say, well, on their own, China's immediate objective when they directly got involved was to save North Korea, and they did. The only reason they got involved, they even had to get involved, is because they backed the North's initial invasion with the understanding that they would bail them out if it backfired on them. So, I would say, in fact, the Chinese are implicated in that initial attack, and thus can be said to condone and desire Kim Il-sung's goals as well, that is, making all of Korea communist, giving all of it to the DPRK. And that objective was blatantly not met, especially since the Chinese themselves, after bailing out the North Koreans, attempted to accomplish that original objective that the North Koreans had failed at. This is something their propaganda never talks about. Their propaganda might go as far as to mention that they took Seoul, but they'll never mention what happened after that, which is that they tried to take over all of Korea. Mao pushed his luck, and it backfired on him. Again. So, while they may have succeeded in saving North Korea, both before and subsequent to saving North Korea, they supported and desired for South Korea to be annexed into North Korea. So, by that metric, which I think is fair, we can in fact say that, like the North Koreans, the Chinese lost the Korean War. It wasn't a total loss, as in North Korea and or China were not conquered, but the idea that, an enemy country has to be totally obliterated in order for that to be a victory or defeat, depending on which side you're on, only really came about because of the world wars, right? Like, we don't say that, Israel lost the Six-Day War because they didn't take over all of Egypt, right? So, despite what they claim, and despite their especially initial battlefield victories, we can say on the whole they lost. And by contrast, that the UN side won, because their initial objective was not to take over North Korea. This is precisely why the South Korean army was kept so undersupplied and ill-prepared, was because the Americans didn't trust Ri not to do something very stupid with it if they did. They didn't want to start shit. Kim Il-sung did, and got backing from Stalin to do it. More importantly, got the troops and equipment necessary. So the Americans saved North Korea, and then they went for the total kill. After accomplishing that objective, they then decided to eliminate the threat, so to speak, by getting rid of North Korea totally. Now, that didn't work out, but the subsequent Chinese attempt to take over South Korea was also defeated. So, since the U.S. was on the I keep saying the U.S., but we mustn't forget that a large part of the UN forces in Korea were Korean, so I should be saying the UN side, just as a catch-all. Since the UN was on the defensive here, rather than the offense, their measure for victory is basically proportional to how much of South Korea they managed to save, and they managed to save most of it, and also added some bits of North Korea, with the net result, if I'm not mistaken, that South Korea is actually slightly larger now than it was in 1950 when the war started. So that means they won. It wasn't a total victory, but the idea of total victory is sort of a World War II, especially era concept, and one need not achieve total victory to be considered the winner.